Principal Economic Advisor, Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal. He is here to take us through the exclusive bond proposals of the Union Budget 2020. He is an expert on the subject, so we can look forward to be hearing some of the key proposals and its impact on the Indian bond market and overall on Indian economy. Mr. Sanyal, good morning. And we see the budget has some exclusive bond proposal, and we know this is going to depend the Indian bond market. One of the key things of the proposals is the bilateral netting bill. Will you take us through the bill and how it is going to impact the Indian bond market?
Sure. The budget speech included several very important changes for the Indian bond market that will radically change the way the Indian bond market functions. So let me take you through several of them, but as you just mentioned, the bilateral netting is an important step. Now, bilateral netting is somewhat of a technical thing, so you will have to bear with me while I explain what it is to you. Let's say there are two banks, and let's say there's Bank A and Bank B. Bank A has an exposure of 100 rupees to Bank B, and Bank B has an exposure of 90 rupees to Bank A. Now, if you look at it on a gross basis, the total exposure in that system is 190 rupees. So if you went by the current laws and the current capitalization requirements, these two banks would have to keep 190 rupees worth of capital aside. But in fact, they only have a net exposure to each other of 10%, 100 minus 90. So what bilateral netting will do is allow you to net off the exposure. So now what happens, only 10 rupees worth equivalent of capital has to be kept aside. And you see in this example, it's not a small change. You're going to 10 and 190, so 19 times. Now obviously this will depend on what the current situation is at any point in time. But you can see that this is not a minor change in capitalization requirement. This is a radically different by orders of magnitude kinds of differences. Now, why is this important? One is, of course, the obvious, it frees up capital. But in fact, that is only the first order impact. The second order impact is even larger, which is that it allows us to create a CDS market, that's credit default swap market. Now, credit default swaps are absolutely critical if you want to have a corporate debt market. Why is this? You see, you have to understand that people tend to think of corporate debt in the same way they think of corporate equity shares. But that shouldn't be the case, because corporate debt, you're issuing continuously corporate debt, but unlike a share, which say if you issued an equity share last year and one this year, they're exactly the same thing. But a 10-year corporate debt from last year and a 10-year corporate debt from this year are completely different products. And furthermore, corporates issue at different levels, 5-year, 4-year, 1 year. So all of these are not fungible with each other. So net result is, unless you are a very large corporate, and there may be just a handful maybe of that scale, most corporates are not issuing enough debt to have a liquid market. So then how do you have a corporate debt market? How does the rest of the world do it? Well, the way they do it is by essentially having a liquid CDS market. The corporate debt swaps is what is basically traded. That is what is liquid. And by the way, once this market is developed, you can do other things with it as well, which is like municipal bonds and all kinds of other things as well. Now, of course, this market has to be well regulated. You don't want this unregulated, unnecessarily complex product to be swimming around. But nevertheless, this creation of the CDS market then allows India to have a corporate debt market of some size. So if the bilateral netting law goes through and then CDS market and the corporate debt market takes off, then what will happen is Indian industry will have a completely new source of income, source of funds, which it doesn't have today in any meaningful way. So this is therefore a foundational change, and it's important. Of course, in addition to that, we have also expanded the FII limits for investment into the corporate market from 9 to 15. But that is almost on the side of this, because really the getting this CDS market going is absolutely critical.
That was quite an exclusive interaction and points on the issue. And let's ask you about one of the first that has been proposed by the budget. That is some specified exclusive in Government of India bonds will now be available the overseas bond market and the indices. So how does that help the Indian bond market?
So, for a long time there have been debates going on, including about sovereign bonds and so on. What was that really about? The real issue here is our ability to access a major pool of funds which are guided by global bond indices. Now, these are not trivial amounts of money. I mean, there are bond indices like the Barclays Bloomberg Bond Index that has as much as $2.5 trillion running on it. So, and there are several of them. But we are not accessing them at all. So the fact that there may be cheap capital on the planet, we are hardly being able to tap it. And now, the question then is, how do we become included in these bond indices? Well, the rules of the bond indices are very clear. They say that you can only be there if the bond is not, if there is 100% freedom for the foreign investor to buy and sell as they wish, which is what their rule. I mean, all of the indices have these rules. Now, in India, as you know, for government securities, we have a 6% rule. Now, there is a good reason to have it because we want to not have too much volatility of money, hot money going back and forth. Now, just taking the 6% to 16% doesn't serve any purpose because they want either 100% or it's not 100%. So that is what the rules are. So what do we now do? So why don't we go to 100%? The reason we don't want to do that is because of a well-known problem called the impossible trinity problem. Anybody who has studied even undergraduate economics will remember the impossible trinity problem, which is this: if you have completely free capital, flows, i.e., you remove all capital controls, then you can either control monetary policy or you can control the exchange rate. Now, we of course have a anchored monetary policy, but we do manage our exchange rate, and it's a float, but it's a managed float. We are still not prepared to completely allow the exchange rate or the monetary policy to kind of do whatever they want to do. We do want to anchor it and maintain certain amount of control on it. So the question then is, if we are not prepared to completely open up our domestic bond market, then how do we get included in the global bond indices? So we talked to many of the bond indices, we did our own research, and then we found that there is actually a way of doing it, which is this. You see, you have to remember that the weightages in the global bond indices is not to the country, but to the bonds. Now, this is absolutely important because this means that the country does not have to be opened out, but bonds have to be opened out. So what you then do is, and which is what we have announced, that we will issue special series bonds in rupees. They are just like domestic, the bonds that you hear 10-year, 5-year, etc. that in the domestic market. There's only one difference, is that these specified series will be completely outside of our capital control. So these ones will be 100% free. So that is basically what we have done. Now, of course, we will still have to issue enough of them. There is, certain liquidity and size requirements. But for a large country like us, it's not a major issue. So we will be effectively creating these rupee bonds, sovereign rupee bonds, which can now float, which can now be bought and sold by foreigners freely. But of course, domestics can also buy and sell it. So it's not like, so it's like any other government 10-year bond that you see in our bond market, except with this change. Now, this will make it eligible for many of the bond indices. So, of course, we now need to begin putting these bonds out. We need to create microstructures for it. I mean, do we need market makers? Do we need, are there other settlement requirements, etc.? Those need to be sorted out. But otherwise, it's not a very complicated thing to do.
By when do you see these things will be launched from the Indian government side?
So, as far as the bilateral netting law is concerned, that's a matter of whenever the government chooses to introduce it in Parliament. The issues are well understood, and then have a debate on it. And of course, the SEBI and RBI, who are also on board, they are aware of all the issues. And of course, SEBI will now have to work out the details of how to regulate this growing CDS market while encouraging it to grow, but at the same time making sure that some of the excesses don't happen. So, but it is an important step. Now, as far as the new bonds are concerned, well, that's, as I said, it's a matter of getting all the microstructures in place and then I'm sure Secretary Economic Affairs will take a call on when to actually do that.
This budget also holds out on taxpayers' charters, which is for the first time being introduced in India. So, Mr. Sanyal will take us through what it means for the Indian taxpayers and how it is going to be beneficial for them in the tax environment.
So, as you know that for a long time there have been a lot of discussion about the fact that the relationship between the Indian taxpayer and the tax administration is disbalanced. There are continuous claims of harassment, of rent seeking, and so on. And this government takes this sort of feedback quite seriously. And so we decided that look at what other countries do about it. After all, many of these issues are not unique to us. So we did some studies and we discovered that some countries like Canada, US, Australia, and so on have introduced something called the Bill of Taxpayer Rights. Now, what are these? So, like the US, for example, has a clear set of 10 taxpayer rights which are enshrined in law, and then there is something called the Taxpayer Advocate Service, which is like an ombudsman system, which then enforces these laws, these taxpayer rights. So, they are rights, they are enshrined in law, and there is a specialized service which enforces this law. Now in Canada there is a slightly different system, Australia has a different system, there is a charter system also in the UK which is somewhat weaker. But the point is, in India, the question is what do we now do? As Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman announced, we will probably create a list. Of course, there will be public discussion on it, but then it will be put into the statute. So now that's important because therefore it is a proper law. Now the question then will be, how do we make it enforceable? So I think again there should be there are some ideas around it. There should be public debate about the matter, and then we will take it forward. But I think if we get it right, it will fundamentally change the relationship between the taxpayer and the tax administration and make it much more balanced.
The taxpayers' charters is one step up from the government, is one of the steps from the government where the government has been continuously trying to remove the tax harassments by the officials, if any, and this certainly will go a long way in removing those fears from the taxpayers' mind. Thank you very much, Mr. Sanyal, for talking to us and clarifying on many important issues which are going to be last bearing impact on the Indian bond market as well as on the Indian taxpayers' mind. Thank you so much.
Thank you.